Welcome. I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, In the Beginning, the Book of Genesis. Today we'll be talking about Lesson 11 of our study, which covers the Book of Genesis, chapter 19. We left off in the previous lesson with Abraham's intercession for these people in Sodom and Gomorrah. God has announced he's intending to go check it out, but he has a pretty good idea of what he's going to find when he does check it out, and that the cities are pretty well doomed. And he and Abraham had this conversation about, well, but what if there are some good people there? And so now we've left it with, if you can find 10 good people, then the cities won't necessarily be doomed. So that is where we have left off. If you read the title of the lesson, or, are vaguely familiar with just about any Bible story, you surely know that God does not find 10 righteous people and that the cities are doomed. So in this lesson, we see the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the events that lead to that. The interesting thing that happened, so that's in the backdrop, right, of the story. The interesting thing that happens and the more relevant part is Lot has gotten himself and his family in the middle of this. So there's the whole exchange of, well, what about Lot, who is, as we see, not a bad guy, maybe a little misguided, but not like wicked like the rest of them. So the kind of forward expedition to scope out whether these cities should really be doomed also turns into an interesting fulfillment of that conversation with Abram. That's not what was. So Lot is not 10 people, but Lot still doesn't perish with the city. So God keeps to the further spirit of that negotiation with Abraham, even though they stopped at 10. It says, okay, well, maybe I won't spare the cities for the sake of Lot and his family, but we can spare Lot and his family from what's happening to the cities. So this turns into a rescue mission for Lot and family, as well as a scoping out of the destruction of the cities. And it further highlights the point of, we don't, in the book of Genesis here, we don't know God very well yet, right? Like, we who have read other parts of the Bible and, know Jesus and some of these things, we have an idea of who this God is and how he does things. But at this point, if you're reading the Bible from the beginning, you don't know very much at all about God. So it's a really big deal. A, he's willing to carry out punishment on wicked people. B, he's not willing for there to be collateral damage in that. And he's going to take extreme measures to not carry out that judgment against not wicked people. It's a thing we take for granted, but that says a lot about God. And that's, I think, because that idea is so ingrained and so familiar to us now, there's not a lot like revolutionary in this lesson, right? It's just like, oh yeah, of course that's how that happens and what God does. But only 11 or only 19 chapters into the Bible, that's not a given, and that's not a thing we would know or understand about God. So this is a big deal. It's also pretty obvious to us. So like the big points we'll talk about, but I don't think any of it's going to be like, oh yeah, God wouldn't do that. Whereas every other God would, because they're not real and they can't punish just good people and not bad people because they're acts of weather or earthquakes and not God. So they can't do that because they're fake. But our God is real and all powerful and can do that. It also, like, when people say, like, it's happened in this country, right? A hurricane hits the South and people are like, that's God punishing people. Like, Yeah, but he doesn't punish just people with unjust people. So he can be more precise than a natural disaster that harms tens, hundreds of thousands of people. And he chooses all the way back to be more precise about that. So maybe he's not causing hurricanes as well. And maybe some things that we attribute to God are a fundamental misunderstanding of who he is, right? So maybe we do need to be reminded of this, that God, the punishment from God is focused only on the deserving, and that it is a very just and necessary consequence of their action, right? They even have the opportunity, had they not committed a further sin, for their past transgressions and wickednesses not to lead to their destruction. They have every opportunity to not be destroyed, and they choose to be destroyed. So, key point here, I think, is to tell us a thing about God that I hope mostly we already know, but it's still very interesting and worth looking at. And so we'll see what happens. Here the angels come into town and they meet Lot at the gate. We don't know why he's there, but he is, which works out well for everyone. And then a thing happens that is very much in parallel with how Abraham greeted the angels. Lot has the same spirit of hospitality of I'm going to treat these strangers who just came into my city and who aren't necessarily he doesn't know they're there to see him more than anybody else. And maybe they weren't until he made them his guests. But he sees them here and he says, hey, you guys, welcome. Come into my house. I will feed you. I will care for you. I will show you hospitality. In the back of his head, there also has to be this idea of, otherwise this isn't going to go very well for you. So I'm going to, not only am I going to care for you, but you want to stay out here on the street. And I think that's a really bad idea for you. So why don't you come into my house and I will treat you as guests to make that more appealing and offer you a meal and all of that. But in the back of my Lot's mind, I'm also trying to make sure, he's urging them strongly, right? He's like, no, come on. And he seems to know the thing that happens later or have some idea, which, good, points for Lot for doing that. Side point that becomes relevant, why is he living there with them? If he knows that that's where he lives and how the people around him behave, why does he want to live in that city again? Like, he has a super rich relative who would love to take care of him, right? All he would have to do is go say, Abraham, you know how I thought it was a good idea to live down in that city? Like, they're awful. Can we find another arrangement? Can you help me out? And he'd be good, right? He's not unprosperous himself, right? He's here by choice, not by necessity, which is, to me, the most interesting thing of this whole thing, because he's not like them, but he is there, and he's choosing to, and at some point, God treats that as, we'll see. We'll see how God interacts with all of it. I don't need to get ahead of us. But for now, there's a deliberate and a neat parallel between Lot and Abraham. So, what Lot was hoping to avoid by bringing these visitors into his house happens anyway. All of the men of the city gather together, and their intention is to know these men who are visiting, right? And that is know in the biblical sense, right? Rape is the thing that we're talking about, right? And it's worth noting that is the crime of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's not that everyone involved is men, right? I know sodomy gets its name from that, and it is a word that means that in English, but that comes from a really weird reading of this text, right? Like, how do you read this and say the problem is that they were all men, and otherwise, like the raping, like that part, as long as it wasn't men, that part would have been fine. Like, definitely not, right? Like, the raping is the problem, not like it's not. This is not the place in the Bible to find God doesn't like homosexuality, right? You can find places where that's addressed and the reasons behind that and God's and the church's view on all of that is in the Bible. It is not here. Here, the position is God doesn't like raping. And that's a good position to take. And like, I don't think we really needed a lot in the Bible to lay that out, but in case anybody was confused on that, that is a bad thing. But that is their intention, at any rate. Strangers here, let's just have some fun. Then a thing happens that to our culture is incredibly jarring. We talked with Abraham, or in Abraham's case, about these values of hospitality and how ingrained and important it was. That's what's going on here, right? Lot has welcomed these men into his house under that spirit of hospitality. And he feels very responsible for their well-being. So in trying to diffuse the situation, he's one guy. He doesn't have the ability to defend against the onslaught of the whole city, right? Like, that's not an option, right? If they've made up their mind that something untoward is going to happen, he doesn't have the ability to stop that. And that ingrained view of hospitality suggests, and I know this is a thing we can't wrap our heads around, right? But suggests that that it's reasonable to offer his daughters to try to save his guests. We can't hear that and think that's a good thing, right? Like, there's no good option there. But our values would say, of course, the family over the guests in this horrible situation, got to protect my kids. And their values and the way they viewed hospitality would have that flipped. You shouldn't read this and say God's okay with either one of those things, right? Or that what Lot did was good or bad. But in the time, that's meant to be something that portrays him as good in terms of holding to that spirit of hospitality. But we shouldn't read that and say that that's the Bible condoning that, oh, of course, Lot giving his daughters to these men was fine, right? Like, no, not fine. Cultural thing at play. We see God, when these angels act, we see that God thinks neither of those things is fine and isn't going to let either of those happen. That's God's view. Lot's trying to do the good thing to the views and mores of the time, but he's not aligned with God in that. He's doing culturally and the best that he can, but we see that his view and God's are not the same, right? So it's really easy to get hung up on that. There are a few of these things in Genesis where the values were just so different, they're really jarring to us. And it's hard to track it and understood. This is weird. And this is jarring. But the key thing is what God does and not what Lot offers to do. And that this is meant to be portraying Lot, again, as doing a good thing and not a bad thing. Whether we agree or not that it's a good thing, and we don't because it's not what our culture says is the right thing to do there. Given the same situation, we would make the opposite choice, understood. But we're meant to read that as a good thing and a positive about Lot's character. So he tries to diffuse the situation and to keep hospitality for these guests that he has taken in. I anticipated this a little bit, but just because that past part was complicated and it's useful to know this is coming. Here we see that God disagrees with Lot's view of how to de-escalate the situation. And God doesn't think, not that the men were buying this angry mob was not buying Lot's suggestion anyway, but regardless, God's view is that's not happening to anybody here. Because as it turns out, God has more power than this mob. And he just strikes them all with blindness, and they go away. Like, it's hard to coordinate that kind of group violence if you can't see, so they leave. That's God's answer here. Lot was trying to de-escalate the situation. As it turns out, also unsuccessfully. God stepped in and said, I know how to stop this. And really interestingly, doesn't just kill them all, even though he's about to. He could just kill them all now. They're already doomed, right? Like, spoiler, they're all doomed and they're all going to die. But that's not what God does here either, which is also very interesting. Here, they are just struck blind, and they're left in the city until the thing happens to the city. Which I suppose I have a few thoughts there. I think that's maybe the most interesting question in this whole thing is, why doesn't God just kill them? They're already doomed. Why mess with this intermediary step of blindness? And I think, that's where that becomes a really pertinent image for how sin affects us in our lives, right? Like, okay, I have committed a mortal sin and I'm still alive. I am those guys, right? I am doomed, right? But I'm not dead. I'm living my life in a state of being doomed, but that sin that I have committed has also caused me to be blind in a very real way, right? Like, I've turned away from God, I've been separated from the light, and I am living in darkness, and I can't see clearly. I can't see, like, these people were in the presence of angels and didn't recognize them. Not that Lot did. But then we're also additionally, by their sins, struck blind, which would make it really hard for them to escape the coming doom. But the doom is still not carried out immediately, even though they're dead men walking. That is how we live in mortal sin, right? Like, we are dead men walking. That sin blinds us and makes it very hard for us to get out of that. But there's still a chance, right? Like, until we're actually dead, there's still a chance for repentance. I don't think there's much chance anybody here in Sodom was going to be repentant. But, if somebody saw that and said, oh, this means no good, and hightailed it out of town as fast as they could, they still could have escaped the doom. They could have said, you know what? The thing we just did was way out of line. I'm not okay being a part of this anymore. I'm gone. And they could have escaped the doom, right? And we can commit mortal sin and say, you know what? That is so out of line, and that's not okay. And I'm going to go to confession, and I'm going to get right in my relationship with God. And then we escape the doom, right? God doesn't, that is why there is a time delay from usually, from I have committed this mortal sin to I am dead and doomed forever. That time allows for thought, reflection, repentance. So there is an interesting commentary there buried in the middle of this on how God carries out sentences. So now these angels let Lot know the plan. So we're here to destroy this place. So maybe, not maybe, so you need to leave. And your family needs to leave. And it's specifically, Lot, you need to leave. Do you have anyone you want to bring with you? Sons, daughters, wife, sons-in-law, anyone. Like, Lot is in a position where he gets to decide who God's mercy extends to, because he showed the hospitality to these guys, and like, again, one person's goodness can lead to mercy for others. It's unclear whether the text intends to imply this or not, but it previously said all the men in the city were in this mob. And Lot's sons-in-law are in the group, all the men in the city. Maybe the implication was a whole lot and they weren't there, but that's not what it says. What it says is all of them, which would suggest that these guys are at home blind and not good guys. And that also seems more likely. Although then their behavior, if you get randomly struck blind and everybody else by a couple guys, and those guys say they're going to destroy the whole place, you also might think that they're not joking. Whereas their response is, "Oh, Lot, you're always a kidder. That's so funny that you would be telling us that these guys who struck half the town blind yesterday have said that they're going to destroy the whole town. Like, that's so funny. That's totally not a thing that's going to happen." And I don't know where you could get that idea from. These guys, they're just random guys. They wouldn't do that, and they wouldn't have the power to do that. And it's just, mass blindness is just a funny coincidence. At any rate, like, there are weird things there, right? Kind of amusing. But the take is, again, when we have been blinded by sin, then we don't see the obvious, right? Like, oh no, like, doing, insert your favorite mortal sin here, couldn't possibly doom me more and be bad. Like, it's fine. Oh, it's so funny to think that would be, like, it can't be that, it's not that big of a deal, right? Like, it causes us to take literally very grave things and to treat them lightly or preposterously, right? That is, the blindness of sin absolutely can do that. So at any rate, Lot's sons-in-law decide not to come. They are mired in their sin, they are blind in their sin, and they stick around where they are, which also causes them to be dead in their sin. Here, Lot's character, we start to see the conflict in it, right? He's doing decently himself, but he doesn't want to leave this city. There are a lot of things you could attribute that to. You could say, it's his whole life and his livelihood and those things. We'll see in a little while, however, there's just something about city dwelling, which is meant to be seen as very bad here, that Lot finds very appealing. And so, despite what all of his neighbors did the previous night, and that these guys who struck them blind and obviously have something going on have said, we're going to destroy this. And he believes them, right? He's not with his sons-in-law saying, oh, that's so funny, that's not going to happen. He believes it, and yet he's dragging his feet and lingering and has to be like physically removed, right? The guys grab them and are like, no, like, go. You need to get out of here. Like, seriously, you have to leave. And you need to leave with some urgency. Flee for your life. We can do this, right? We can, even if we're generally doing okay, we can put ourselves in sin-adjacent situations. When you give stuff up, it can be really easy not to keep it close at hand, right? And it's okay. It's over there, but I need it, nearby. But I'm not going to sin, but just in case, we're going to not shut the door on it entirely. And we'll just keep it nearby for, because it's comfortable. Human nature makes that really easy to do, but that is not God's view of how this works, right? Like Jesus eventually says, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Not, that's too bad, but you need your hand. It's distance yourself from the things that are temptation and an environment that is sinful, right? And that is the thing that Lot's not willing to do, right? Like, he's dragged literally into it, but he's more comfortable being in that sin-adjacent situation. So even though he acted well here toward these strangers, you have to wonder, what's his day-to-day life like? He was willing to marry off his daughters to people in the city. And have that become his family, right? Like, what decisions is he making? What is he building for him and his family and his life being there? And that he doesn't seem to want to, he chose it and seems to want to keep choosing it and has to be removed from it by God. And that's the complexity of the Lot situation, is he's a decent guy, but he's putting himself in a spot where he cannot succeed. And he's choosing that. And people do that, right? Like, we see people do that way too often. We do that way too often. Where are we really willing to do, being holy means being set apart. Are we really willing to, literally, are we really willing to be set apart? Or are we only comfortable going so far as we can without being set apart, which is by definition not holy. Anyway, Lot is an interesting example for reflection, because he's not a bad guy, but he's not doing the things he needs to be Abraham. So he left with Abraham. He showed he's learned and has some similar values to Abraham. But where Abraham said, Lot, just pick whichever area of the land you want. Lot was like, I want the good part. And Abraham said, yeah, I'm comfortable chilling out here in the country with my sheep and God. And Lot said, yeah, I'm going to go settle down in that city. And he's almost there, right? Like, he's making some very good choices. He's making some not good choices. And they seem to be more selfish, but also, like, Abraham is a hard guy to live up to, but Abraham is all in on faith in God, right? And Lot is one foot in on faith in God and one foot on let's see what the world has to offer. He's not totally wicked like the people he's living with, but he's not totally on board like his relative Abraham. And so he, in that regard, where I think Lot is interesting is I think he's most of us, right? Like, we're not most people I know managing to go take those leaps of faith and go all in like Abraham is. But we're not, if you're watching this video, you're probably not all in the city in the mob that's going to do horrible things either, right? I think most of us probably are Lot, where we're not fully willing to remove ourselves from bad situations, bad things, to go all in for the sake of God, but we're not awful either. And that's where he becomes a figure worth reflecting on a little bit. The ultimate conclusion is that's not enough, by the way. So that's also worth thinking about. Here we see exactly that attitude of Lot. These angels are saying, you should go over there in the hills to escape the doom. And Lot says, that little city is closer though, and it's a small one. It's just a little bit. I'll be fine there. Thanks, guys. But, we're buddies now, right? Like, I've found favor with you. You're helping me out. So help me out going there, not going where you suggested, right? They suggested, dude, you need to remove yourself from these sinful situations, right? Like, they're not just trying to spare him right now, but longer term too. Their point is, you really, you need to get out of these situations. Go live in the hills. Get out of town, right? Like, literally be not in towns, in cities. And Lot's again saying, well, I don't know about that. It's just a small city. And, I think I want to go there, guys. Is that can that be okay? And they do let him do that, but because that wasn't on their, destroy list. So I mean, it's technically okay, but it is not. And that's again, I think, where Lot is the good model of us, right? Like, compromising with God. Like, yeah, I know, God, that this would be the really good thing to do, but what if I did not that? But it won't be super bad, like just a little bad. Like, that's okay, right? Right, God? Right? Because you like me, and so you love me, in fact, so it's fine, right? Like, nobody watching this has ever had that conversation with God, I'm sure. We definitely don't do that. It's easy when you see it to say, wow, this is stupid. Why would this guy do this? And then, extrapolating the circumstances, though, it's like, oh, I do that a lot. No pun intended on the guy's name, right? Like, I just do that frequently. And it seems reasonable when I'm doing it. It seems absurd when Lot is doing it. It seems absurd sometimes when my friends are doing it as well. And also reasonable when I'm doing it. And the area to focus on there is not when my friends are doing it. It's when I'm doing it. If it looks different in the mirror than it does outside, then I've got some bad mental gymnastics going on, right? Like, that would be a good thing to fix. And that would be a good call to growth and development, would be maybe take some of those blinders off and have a hard look at some things in my own life. But at any rate, here for our story, the angels agreed to let Lot stay in the little city. This is the part we know, right? The Lord rains brimstone and fire out of heaven onto Sodom and Gomorrah. Interestingly, Gomorrah never got a chance to, God only visited Sodom and said, yep, both of you are done, which kind of highlights that the angels were there more to get Lot than they were to, really take an account of every person, because God already knew who was naughty and who was nice when he had the conversation with Abraham. So his primary purpose was to encounter Lot. So he went to Sodom, and he did encounter Lot, and he pulled Lot out, and then he did away with the cities. And God has made this idea, or this statement, again, these are so much about how we should live our lives and relate to change, had said, don't look back. And Lot's wife does, right? And she becomes a pillar of salt. That's also super well-known thing, right? I've read some things. I haven't seen anything that really strikes me as this really makes sense as the reason for this. So I'm just going to say I don't know why it's a pillar of salt. There's probably a really good reason, and I just don't know what it is. That happens sometimes with these things. Maybe someday it'll come to me. But for now, because I don't know that, the important point is, it's fatal, right? She looks back and, she's frozen that way and is fatal, right? And it's because of the looking back. So, and that I think we can relate to, right? If you pull yourself out of a sinful situation and you're still leaning back into that situation, you are not out of it, right? You're just not. And so the doom that applied to the people in the situation, she demonstrated she's not out of the situation. So doom, secondhand doom, is what happens there. And that definitely happens to us, right? Again, fire and brimstone and pillars of salt aside, if you get out of a bad situation and you keep looking back into the bad situation, you are not out of the bad situation. And the doom from the bad situation is going to find you. That is still a perilous and a grave situation. And she did not appreciate the gravity of that, or take God seriously when he said, you can't look back. So city's destroyed, Lot's wife, and Lot is now married to a pillar of salt. Here we see, again, Abraham's faith. He had talked with God, and God had said, see those cities? Those are done for. And he and Abraham had that conversation. So the next day, Abraham goes back out to look to see what happened, because, he believes God when God says that something's going to happen there. And Lot does live there. So he goes out to look and says, oh, yep, God did what he said he was going to do. They're super destroyed now. So it's worth knowing, Abraham didn't think God was kidding, right? And came to check up on what happened. Beyond that, no new information there. So this part's controversial. We thought, the sodomy part was, this lesson is just chock full of spicy things in the Old Testament. This one being incest. So the situation, Lot, having said, where I'd really like to live is that city, suddenly decides maybe that's not a good idea. Whether it was he got there and realized, these city folk aren't very welcoming to new people, to say the least, or his wife turning into a pillar of salt made him a little more skeptical on the idea of going back to what he was doing before. At any rate, he rethinks and decides, instead of living in the city, to live in a cave with his daughters. Why he doesn't, he could still go to Abraham right now, right? He had, and they could surely live together. They did before. He could take his daughters, go live with Abraham, and they could do very well. So he won't go to the city, but he won't go to Abraham. And he's stuck in the middle and doing nothing. And that's not great. And in fact, we never see him again with Abraham, even though it was for the sake of Abraham more than anything that God spared him. He's still removing himself, which isn't great in general, and it this winds down his story a bit. But first we have this thing where his daughters, living in a cave, are saying, there aren't any men in this cave. Where are we going to find husbands? Dad won't take us back to Abraham and those people, nor are we living in the city, and there's a noticeable lack of marriageable men in the cave. Which is a fair point. To that, they're correct. Then they decide, however, we need to have children to carry on our lines. And there aren't eligible bachelors in the cave. There is Dad. And then they go through this thing where they get their father drunk, they sleep with them, and they have children. I think it goes without saying that this is not the Bible endorsing or encouraging incest, right? This is the end of this story winding down, and we'll see some of the long-term implications of this for what comes of that union is bad. That it's meant to be seen as bad. This is bad. And this is bad fruits of bad decisions, right? By Lot and by his family. I don't think we need to dwell on it much more than this is bad. And overconsumption of alcohol is also bad, right? Lot finds himself in a position where he does things that he wouldn't have otherwise done because he's drunk, which allows for more bad. So bad. This is bad. I don't think we need to beat a dead horse. Don't do this. The result of now we see another bit of this is how these people came about. And specifically, these are the Moabites and the Ammonites that come from this union. And those people are at constant odds also with the people of God. The lesson points out that there is one very famous, very good Moabite in Ruth who becomes the grandmother of David. And her book and her story is great. Awesome character. Great story. But that is the exception, right? In general, Moabites and Ammonites aren't really followers of God, which, is consistent with the decisions Lot and family have been making. And this is meant to, whether this really happened this way or not, some of these, and this is how these people we don't like came about, sorts of things make it into the Bible. And so, we get a history of Moabites and Ammonites that is very unflattering, right? And it's meant to be very unflattering. And that's another part of the point here. And that pretty well concludes, for the purposes of Genesis, we don't care about Lot or really very much Moabites or Ammonites anymore. They matter more later, but for now, that is ending a story about not Abraham, so that we can get back to Abraham. And we see that happen. We've talked about it. We see that happen in Genesis quite a bit, right? We go down another branch far enough to see it end for the purposes of relationship with God. And then we go back up down the main branch. And then the branch is a little, and we trace all of it until we say, yeah, that side's not going anywhere. Back down, where are we going? So this just rules out that anything to do with Lot is going to have anything to do with the people of God. So now we're back to, who does? Abraham. This has been an overview of Lesson 11 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study, In the Beginning, the Book of Genesis. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.